This episode of the Hill Country Podcast, I visit with Dr. Don Frazier, who is the head of the Texas Center at Schreiner University. We talk about the Texas Center, talk a whole lot about Texas history, what it means, and why the Texas Center is one of the leading academic institutions for the study of Texas history.
The Texas Hill Country is one of the most beautiful places on earth. In this podcast, recent Hill Country resident Tom Fox visits with the people and organizations that make this one of the most unique areas of Texas. Join Tom as he explores the people, places, and their activities of the Texas Hill Country.
Episode of the Hill Country Podcast. Today I have with me Louis Amestoy. Louis is the publisher of the Kerrville Lead, and frankly, it's one of the most innovative online local daily newspapers I have ever come across. And so, Louis, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this. This is great.
So, Louis, I tell people when I ask them if they'll come on the podcast, it's just a virtual cup of coffee with Tom. However, this is the first time it's been actually over a cup of coffee and outdoors at Starbucks. Yes. For those people who are wondering what the strange noises are, we're actually doing this with a real cup of coffee at Starbucks. So could you tell us a little bit about your professional background?
Sure. I've been in this business for 20 years, or not 20 years, 30 years. I started when I was actually 19 years old, working for a daily newspaper in my hometown. I'll never forget, I was taking some college classes at a community college, and they had a journalist come in, and he said, don't quit school. And he's like, oh, I'm like, why? He says, because you'll get offered a job here real soon. And I did get offered a job, and I quit school, and I never really went back. And so I just made a career of it. And I worked at small dailies in California, Southern California, for most of my career. And in 1998, I stepped up and I went up to the San Bernardino Sun, which was about a 80,000 circulation newspaper at the time. And from there, I just continued to work hard on the I just continued to work hard on my career, basically, from that point forward. And I did sports for the most part for the first half of my career. And then it said to me, I looked for promotion. I had a family, and I said one day that I needed to be on a higher income level. So I took a promotion as an assistant city editor. And from there, my management career took off. And it went to San Bernardino, California, Riverside, California. And also, then I took a job in 2012 at the Bakersfield, California, which is probably my longest length of stay anywhere. And I did that as an audience development director kind of position, integrating multimedia into the print world. I'd worked in online since 2005, so this was a kind of a familiar role in audience development and audience engagement. And I rose through that to become the VP of news and the executive editor of that paper. And then I left in 2016 to kind of explore other things, being a publisher. I did some consulting for a radio station group in California. I worked in oil and gas for a little while. I worked in Colorado, and then I came here in 2019. And I left the Kerrville Daily Times in 2020. And I'm always candid about it. I did not agree with the direction of the newspaper, and I wanted something else. So I quit. I took the biggest leap I've taken in my career, and I said, I'm going to start this thing called the Lead, and it got started, and here we are. And in the interim of that, I did the Lead for about 9 weeks in January through February, into the first week of March. But I also had people reaching out to me about possible jobs, and I was nervous about the money. And so I took a job up in Greenville, Texas, for 5 months. I was 3 months into the job when I had applied previously to a series of journalism sort of funding opportunities, and out of the blue, from when I guess my got passed on to somebody at Facebook, and they were launching this pilot program. Now they said I applied for it. I don't really remember the whole process of applying for it. I remember applying for something else and knowing I wasn't going to get it, and then getting an email from them saying you might be reached for something else. And sure enough, it was Facebook, and Facebook said we'd like to be part of this pilot program, and we'll give you funding for this. And that's how the Lead got resurrected in August of 2021.
But could you tell us a little bit about what the Facebook pilot project was and what they were trying to focus and how that dovetailed into what you wanted to do?
Yeah, so Facebook wanted to expand its Facebook's in a difficult position in a lot of ways. They consume content like you wouldn't believe, and because of the way that the algorithm works and the way people consume information and media. If you think about it, there's no more this time in our life, people are consuming more content than they've ever consumed before. And it's pretty incredible to think about sort of all the things you see throughout the day. The problem is that it's filtering out the good from the bad when it comes to that piece of it. And Facebook, I think, looked at it and said, we're getting criticized for our role in the 2020 election. We're getting criticized for essentially the content that other people are sharing. We're also making money off of this content because people are coming to our site. Publishers have to use Facebook in order to engage in their audiences, and so they decided, there's a lot of really talented independent journalists, independent writers out there who need a platform. They were also seeing the success that Substack and other newsletter platforms were building, and they decided, well, let's get into that game. So what they did was they started with a group of about 150 writers. And those writers included Mitch Albom, from the Detroit Free Press, best-selling author, Adam Grant, who's a psychologist. They also included Malcolm Gladwell, who's probably one of the top thinkers out there as far as, disruptive innovation and things like that. And so, they started out the really heavy hitters. But they also wanted to reach down and say, well, we're going to go ahead and have, more local people that are out there, or people that are serving niches. And so mine was strictly, look, I want to cover, they asked me, what do you want to cover? And I said, well, I want to cover, the growth and development in Kerr County. I think that the interface of growth and development in Texas is really fascinating. I don't know that it's fully covered the way that it maybe should be, at least here in the Hill Country, and how that impacts water, the environment, and our overall quality of life. And so that was the impetus for that. And so Facebook came to me and said, hey, here's the deal. We want you to, launch this program, and you're going to be in this group of I think it was 50 writers originally who were locally focused. And we were one of only 2 in the state of Texas that were selected for this first round. And hopefully, I hope they will expand this program more fully. And it's called Bulletin. And the beauty of it is that Facebook said, well, we recognize that not everybody wants to be on Facebook. So the Lead is powered by a Facebook website that you don't need to be a member of Facebook to access the content to. Now, if you want to become a member and pay us, then you have to be a part of Facebook. That's sort of the trade-off on that. But so far, we've been able to kind of grow pretty quickly here in the last 90 days in particular.
So Louis, I moved here in April, and I'm a Facebook user, and both a consumer and creator on Facebook for my podcast network. And I think I stumbled upon you maybe in early September. But the thing that struck me was at one of the local festivals this summer, my wife and I sat down and we're having a sandwich, and a couple of ladies joined us, and they brought up the Lead.
Oh, wow.
And they said, have you heard of the Lead? And I said, well, I had. In fact, I wanted to get in touch with you. So you really just tapped into, I guess you'd call it a need, but certainly a market. And let me turn to a tragic event that happened in Kerrville recently, but to me, it showed the power of what you guys and what you're doing at the Lead. And that, of course, was the tragedy at the drag races.
Yeah.
And my wife and I think we're in Fredericksburg, and we're having lunch. So I'm, of course, looking at my phone,
Right.
and it pops up a notice on Facebook from the Lead. There's been a tragedy at these drag races. We're on site, and more details to follow. And literally, you were there,
Yeah.
but because you had someone there.
Yeah.
And then you followed that during the day. You gave us updates as information became available. And then I can't remember if it was the next day, because the next day was Sunday, but it may have been Monday. You did a brilliant long-form article piece about, you interviewed the organizers, you interviewed some of the emergency response personnel, you talked to some of the people who were there, talked about to some of the witnesses, but you also went into a deep dive into the safety precautions, what was done, what wasn't done. And it was really just a beautiful piece of what I would call long-form journalism.
Yeah.
But to me, it really showed the power of what you guys bring, because you were there, you gave updates in real time during the day, and then on the next, like I said, I couldn't remember the next day or the next Monday, the weekday, you gave us a long-form piece with a lot of content that you would typically see in a piece of print journalism. How did that work from your side? Did you get a call? Were you the one on site?
Well, I got, and I have to give full credit to this. I'd actually been there earlier in the day, and I'm candid about this. I find that type of racing boring. I'm not really a motorsports person, but I covered drag racing for many years. Wrote a book about it with a friend of mine named Mike Griffith, who's a longtime sports writer at Bakersfield, California. And so through the years, through a 5-year period, I think I probably covered, 25 or 30 races, during that period, including one that involved the fatality of a drag racing fatality. And so, that was one that when I saw the initial plan for the thing, I'm like, this is not really very safe. This is not a good idea. And I spoke about that actually on my show on September 14th. When the county had approved it the day before. I was there, I went, I saw that they didn't have anything beyond the finish line's eighth of a mile, 660 feet. And I'm like, no, this is too much. So I left, and Daryl Beecham, who is the director of the Museum of Western Art, texts me. He says, I'm just watching all this stuff heading to what appears to be the airport. So then I knew that Brenda Hughes, who's on the city council, was there. I texted her and I said, hey, what's going on? She goes, bad crash. So I ran back out there, talked my way back into the facility, saw the scene. I'm almost 100% certain, I can't get them to confirm it, but I'm almost certain that I took a picture of a police officer standing, I believe, over the body of the 6-year-old child, Daniel Jones, who was killed in the crash pretty much instantly. But, and this is the thing that's irritating about journalism and powerful at the same time, is that stuff is tough to do. And it's really hard to write. It's really hard to talk to people who are upset about what had happened, what they'd witnessed. So it was it was actually a sourcing challenge, but we pulled a lot of the documents that were there to kind of map out what was happening. So I had a pretty good idea of how that was going to work. But man, it was one of those things where you kind of looked at it and you're like, something bad could happen here if you're not careful. Let's hope that nothing bad happens. And when I got that call or that text from Daryl, I was like, dang it, I know this is probably, I could just see what happened. And if you can imagine drag racing, what the organizers did was they put in these water barriers, essentially. It's like almost like a K-rail, but made out of rigid plastic. And K-rail is like a concrete barrier, but these are made out of plastic. They were filled with water, allegedly filled with water, because we don't know if all of them were filled with water or not. And they had these barriers going all the way down to the 660-foot mark, instead of having them go out an extra 300 feet, which would have basically saved the lives of those people. The other problem with this event was, and we spoke about this as well, was that if you think about the culture of racing. It's about being close, you know. And we see that in bike racing, we see that in motorcycle racing, we see that in off-road racing, and fatalities have always happened in this. And several years ago in California, we had a situation with an off-road race where one of these guys got loose coming off a jump, basically, and the crowd was right underneath of him, and he landed right on him, killed 8 of them. And so, you know, you have that culture of closeness, and then when you don't have stands, you don't have a vertical presence to kind of elevate those folks, what are they going to do? Well, they can't see, so they're going to inch closer and closer and closer, almost down to a funnel by the end of the top end. And that top end was unprotected. And if you price out what these guys were looking at, you know, to spend, you know, if they would have put in bleachers and they would have put in, you know, the extra thing, it probably would have made the event you know, not worth it at that point. And what's interesting is that from our perspective on the story is that that's really the story too. Is that at what point does the county or the city come up and say, well, how do we risk manage this piece, you know? And honestly, I don't think they did a very good job of it. They looked at it from the perspective of this was a successful event in March of earlier this year. Everything was fine, and there was no problems. And at one point I said on my show before the race, I said, look, guys, you know, people get killed in these things. And like, oh, well, you're just kind of worrying too much about stuff. And, you know, it didn't need to happen that way. And unfortunately it did. But hopefully the outcome of this is that you'll see some movement to take a closer look at some of these events that they just signed off on.
So you used a term in there that's going to be very familiar to the rest of my podcast audience, perhaps not the Hill Country podcast, but risk management.
Yeah.
And that's something that every business has to do. You're always going to have risk, and you try to manage those risks. And when I read your piece, it was clear to me the risk management problems involved, and then the risk management strategies that could have been involved, could have been brought to bear, but for whatever reason, whether it was cost or other, they weren't brought to bear.
We were doing a little bit of risk management here from being outside with the bee.
But I mean, I've lost a friend to drag racing. I used to be a big aficionado, but I was always in the stands, and I always felt safe. Yeah. And here we just didn't have that luxury.
No, we didn't have that here. And I think that's the thing that you know, when you put something out there, you know, at this level and say, and this is where my experience comes in when I talk about this. And I don't think we always respect experience, you know. And it's like, hey, that might not be the best idea in the world, you know, because there's this, and this still to have out there. And the experience of it is that nobody asked the questions that should have been asked, you know, from a stewardship standpoint. And we had a risk manager come on my webcast, and you know, he basically said, you know, that's where he would draw, you know, he's concerned about it. So you don't have this sort of mentality sometimes about what that means. And so it's an interesting situation. This guy, he's really interested in your recording.
The other thing you mentioned was your show, and you're on every morning, I think.
Every morning.
Is it 5 days a week or 7?
5 days a week.
So tell us about the show, and how does that relate to the journalism part of what you do?
Well, so, you know, the Lead's idea, there's several parts of this I've always wanted to do, and this is really the time where I was able to kind of realize this, is that I believe very much in accessibility and engagement. And so in the previous jobs, we've done sort of similar types of things, or tried to do similar types of things, but you know, for me, the show is a presence that is there every single day, 5 days a week. Fortunately, I don't have to host it every single time. I have another co-host on Thursdays. But it's transparent. You know, people get to see me interview. They get to see who I'm talking to. We have a little bit of fun. I do a little bit of analysis on the news. It's probably a little more opinion-based than I probably should, but it's a nice gateway to my other things that I do. And so I look at it as, like, I believe very much when I have content that I believe in a layered approach to content. So I look at it from, here is here is my video component, which is my show. Oh, which by the way is designed as a podcast essentially, so I can make it into an MP3 for audio distribution. We're actually sending some of this through Spotify now. I'm a little bad about updating that. And then that just leads to the next thing. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll write stories out of those interviews. So if I have a really good guest, I will do my best to go back, listen to that whole thing, and transcribe the notes and take out the best of it from the interview. And then it just is an opportunity for people to come on and share what they're doing in their either nonprofits. Like on Friday, we're having a guest come on who's going to talk to me about chronic wasting disease, which is an issue here with the deer population here in Kerr County. Potential problem, not one that we've necessarily identified at this point, but it is here in Texas, and it can do really terrible things, to our hunting economy and things like that. So those questions, those are just great ways and great conversations and great segments. But the most powerful show that we ended up doing was the Monday after the race happened. And we had about 3,000 viewers for that particular event, which is, 3 to 4 times what we normally would have. So that was interesting to experience as well.
So let me turn maybe now to the future. Where do you hope to take the lead, or where do you see it going? Your relationship with Facebook going forward, and maybe what you're looking at doing.
Well, I mean, after working for people for a long time, and to be my own publisher and editor is such a great reward, quite frankly. People are like, why do you work so hard? I'm like, well, because you kind of have to. And I don't know anything else. Like my interests personally align with my career, and that's sort of an unfortunate thing I think for some people. I don't take a break. My brothers are always like giving me a hard time about that, and they're like, there's any time you're not doing like photography or video. I'm like, nope, never. And so when I go places, I always think about it from a journalism standpoint, and when I travel, I always, what kind of stories can I tell out of this element? So my goal is to be fully sustainable outside of Facebook within 2 years. I think Facebook set up a pretty good platform for us to make that a reality. The question gets down to is how much work do I put myself through before I hire somebody, and I know I need to get to a certain point, but I think it's attainable. I think I think the revenue is there. I think the transition has happened. One of the things that's interesting is that I got into live streaming video very early, like in 2007. I was one of the first newspaper companies in the U.S. to actually actively do live streaming, and we built live streaming platforms in different places. We made a pitch at one point. One of the papers I worked at was owned by the Dallas Morning News, and we made the pitch in 2010. We said, look, we're going to see amplification of TV. We're going to see all this VOD. At the time they called it, over-the-top delivery of content, and you're going to see cable disrupted. And we think that we can serve the local thing with an investment. This was in Southern California. That because the Los Angeles TV stations don't cover us, we can be successful as our own broadcast entity if we have the right equipment. So I made the pitch, and they were like, "No, we're a newspaper company." This is Dallas Morning News, who was tinkering around with all these crazy, stupid investments, to do things, but we had a solution right there. We were just way too early for it. Now most newspapers are so late to the game on web video content that it's almost impossible to catch up. So I view it as a multi-platform opportunity for us, that the video component of it will be a significant driver of our revenue, that Facebook will provide us the tools to fulfill other advertising initiatives through native content, which is advertising content that we write for people, which is a huge thing for a lot of local businesses, and the fact that Facebook can help us with our reach is significant. We've grown from 1,000 followers in early August, or 900 followers, to almost 3,600 as of today. And we are growing the email database, every day. We're getting new subscribers every day. So those are all things that, I'm confident that in 2 years that we'll be fully sustainable and maybe have a couple employees. So
sounds a lot like the Compliance Podcast Network. The other thing that really struck me about what you're doing is, even more than filling a niche, you're filling a need, and that need is for online content at the the most granular local level.
Right.
And if this model succeeds, it seems to me it could be a model for this type of organization in multiple towns across Texas and indeed across the country.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing about newspapers that are problematic for a lot of people don't really understand, is that the model is continuing to see a downward trend in revenue, right? So what you're seeing is that to make up for that downward trend in advertising revenue, the publishers who have enormous fixed costs, usually not even in the journalism. So, if you were a journalist here in Kerrville and you wanted to come work, you'd make less money right now than you would to work at Taco Bell. That's how bad that situation is. So, because their fixed costs are spread out everywhere else. They don't have any resources to do this. When I came to Kerrville, took a huge pay cut. They really couldn't afford me, at that point. But Facebook could. And so putting somebody like myself who has a pretty good idea what they're doing, at this stage of my life, is a significant opportunity. And I'm not burdened by the payroll of circulation or advertising or the press room. I had somebody who was possibly interested in, investing in me, and I was like, you need the press? And I'm like, no, please no. I do zero interest in that, because that's millions of dollars in capital startup costs. I think the pandemic has shown us that people are willing more than ever to pay for things online. There's more comfort in that. And so this was the unintended consequences of what happened in the pandemic, was that people got stuck at home, they couldn't go shopping, they couldn't do anything, and that kind of developed. The need here in Kerr County was, I believed, that if you look at the growth and development issues in Kerr County, and I hate to do it to people, but I do it all the time because I grew up in Southern California. And Texans have a really hard time, native Texans have a really hard time understanding the scale of the Los Angeles area, say the Los Angeles market. There's 40 million people live in California. 30 of them live, below, basically, the Grapevine and in the basin of Los Angeles, And so a lot of that was, this is the first time ever that California hasn't seen significant growth. The popular mythology of this is, oh, well, it's because, there are all those liberal policies. Well, it's impossible to live out there because it's crowded and it's expensive. But what you're seeing is that same sort of development pressure with less regulation and less planning and less zoning here in Texas. And so, that's really fascinating to watch, because what's it going to look like? I'll tell people, yeah, this town's 25,000. The town my wife and I grew up in Southern California, which had no access to a freeway. We have Interstate 10 right here. No access to a freeway. Went from maybe 30,000. We lived there in 1990. We got married in 1997. So, a couple houses there. That city's gone from about that size, 30,000, to 95,000 in the 2020 census. That's this extraordinary amount of growth. And what you're seeing in Texans are just as guilty of this as Californians. They'll drive. You know, oh, I want to. If I can find a nice house in Kerrville, and I'll drive to San Antonio. You know, or I'll drive to Austin if it fits, because I want to have a nice quality of life and have a nice house. And so you're seeing that sort of emerge, and you're already seeing it emerge, like in Centerpoint, in eastern part of Kerr County, where people are like, this is nice, this is flat, I can build something here. I have access to the 10. I got a sewer line that's coming in. And there's a company over here that's hiring. They got good schools. What are we going to do? And I don't think anybody here is really understanding the challenge that you face with the environment, the water, land use, and it's a property rights issue too. Just because I want to build, something next to you, does that mean I have the right to impact your quality of life? So these are the questions I think that need to be really closely followed, and I think it takes a veteran person to really understand what that looks like, and that is, to me, the need right now.
So, listen, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but before we leave, I was wondering if you could tell us, or if anyone wanted more information on the Lead or any of the topics you've talked about, and perhaps even to subscribe, where could they go?
Yeah, KerrCountyLead.com is the LEAD, KerrCountyLead.com. It'll redirect you to a site called KerrCountyLead.bulletin.com, which is the main, which is the portal you get into from Facebook. But yeah, Kerr County Lead will get you there. It's $5.99 a month to subscribe, $54.99 for a full year. We are in the process. A lot of the content now is free. We're in the process right now of sort of moving people off of, saying, okay, well, this, like today, we had one today where I put one out there that was behind the paywall completely, so you had to pay to get to that content. We'll see if that actually, that bears fruit for us. I'm a general interest journalist in a lot of ways. There's a lot of niche people out there, but I like to cover everything. And so, I covered city council last night. That was a crazy meeting. But you know what? I'm just as happy going and taking photos of kids getting Halloween candy at our, different parks and events. This is a great community for kids and for families and for retirees as well. And so there's just so many stories out there that we're going to be able to cover. And I know I'll never get to, even 10% of them by the time I'm, worn out by this. So.
Well, this has been great. I'm really glad to have met you, and really want to thank you for what you're doing as a resident of Kerr County, although not as a resident of Kerrville. And I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you too.
This is Tom Fox again. We're going to link to the Texas Center at Schreiner University in the show notes. I hope you will check it out. It really is one of the finest academic institutions for Texas history I've come across, and they have a large memorabilia collection as well. I hope you will join me for another episode of the Hill Country Podcast, where I continue to explore the people, places, and things which makes this part of Texas one of the most unique. Thanks again. If you're a resident of the Hill Country and would like to tell your story, please give me a shout at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. The Hill Country Podcast is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.